In this video, we're going to talk about the concepts of intermittency and dispatchability. These closely related ideas talk about whether certain energy sources are always available or if we can essentially produce more or less of them on demand. So the idea behind this video is that we have to consider whether or not different power sources are always on, or if they're always available, and if so, how fast can we make them available? Let's begin with the concept of intermittency. When something is intermittent, it means that it's not producing it consistently. So if you're an intermittently attending class, you're not coming to class very often. Intermittent sources of energy are also not producing energy all the time. Basically, there's a lot of ups and downs in the amount of energy that's being produced. So it increases and decreases in response to something that's happening in the larger environment. Now, all sources of energy have some degree of intermittency because they're not always available due to things like maintenance. So even very reliable sources of energy that seem like they're always producing, like nuclear power, for example, sometimes have to be taken offline so that they can be maintained and checked for safety. But normally what we're talking about is a lot of renewable sources, particularly wind and solar, when we're talking about intermittent sources. So when we're talking about these, intermittency can happen because of time of day. So solar is a really obvious example. We don't produce any solar energy at 2 a.m. because there's no sun out and there's no fuel source for those solar panels. We also know, however, that there's intermittency based on the time of year. Consider something like solar panels. Generally speaking, winters are cloudier, they're snowier, and the days are shorter, so there's going to be a lot less power that's being produced in the winter months compared to the summer months when the days tend to be longer and sunnier. So we're going to look at that kind of intermittency in a little bit more detail using the example of wind. The following graph shows how many gigawatts of electricity were being produced by Ontario's wind power in 2018 at different times of the year. So one of the things that you'll notice is that the highest month is January, because that's the coldest part of the year, and the winter months and the fall months tend to be higher producing as well. As we come into the warmer spring and summer, however, we see that wind energy produces a lot less. For some very complicated meteorological reasons, there's generally less wind production in warmer summer areas in Ontario and more during the colder winter months. That means if we were relying on wind electricity to generate power for air conditioning, we might be in a little bit of a trouble because, again, we're not producing nearly as much wind power during the spring and summer months. But as we come into the cold season, we're producing more. So wind electricity is a good example of something that tends to be seasonally intermittent. It's something that produces more power or less power depending on the time of year. The second concept that we also need to consider is somewhat related to intermittency, and it's the idea of dispatchability. So when an electricity system needs to figure out how much is being produced, we basically need to match the supply of electricity to the demand of the consumers who are using it. And this is one of the reasons why dispatchable power can be useful. If a lot of people want to use more electricity for whatever reason, it's helpful to have something that we can turn on. And a source of energy that can either turn on and produce more or turn off and produce less relatively easy is considered a dispatchable source of power. So again, this is simply something that can go up or down, can increase or decrease in response to the energy use. And one of the concepts that you'll see kind of being used when you hear about dispatchability is the idea of ramping up or down. And it's basically this idea of turning on the electricity systems when we ramp things up and turning them off when we ramp things down. But again, increase, decrease, ramping up and down are very similar kinds of ideas. But the reason why we want to do this is to try to match the supply and demand, how much we're making versus how much people actually want to use. And when we're considering the operation of any kind of complex electricity system, it is important to note that that matching as closely as possible is always the biggest goal of the system operators. It's never going to be perfect, but the closer we can get to matching supply and demand together, the better the system's going to be. Now, in some situations, these aren't necessarily matched, and we run into problems depending on whether supply is too high or it's too low. So in the case where we're producing too little electricity, or there's too little supply and too much demand, people want more electricity than is being produced, one of the things that can happen is that there's the risk of the system essentially failing and components of the electricity system failing. And this can manifest in terms of blackouts, where people simply lose their power, as well as brownouts, where there is some electricity, but there's not enough. And that insufficient amount of power can actually damage many sensitive electrical pieces of electrical equipment. If you've ever been in your house and you've ever looked up and you've seen your light bulb flickering, and then you lose the power shortly after, that point where the light bulb was flickering before it went completely out is exactly what's happening in a brownout, but in a larger scale. So you get the flickering because the light bulb doesn't get enough energy to power itself, and it's trying to work, but it's not doing a very good job. And if it were to continue running like that for a long period of time, you would likely lose the light bulb and it would get damaged in some way. So blackouts mean no power at all. Brownouts mean too little, and that too little power can actually damage a lot of equipment, not only in our homes, but also in the larger electricity system. Now, if there's too much electricity being produced and there's not enough demand to use that electricity, the system essentially has to curtail or get rid of that excess amount of energy, also in order to prevent damage. So we don't want our appliances or our devices or our components of our electricity system getting too much power either, because that can also damage them. And of course, the problem with doing this is that it costs money in many cases to generate electricity. We're burning coal or natural gas, or we're using uranium. So essentially, if we're wasting that electricity, it's almost like we're literally burning good money. So again, we're wasting money and we're wasting energy when we're doing this. And of course, if we're wasting fossil fuels, that's especially bad because we're not getting any benefit and we're making global warming worse. So again, both of these problems are why the people who operate electricity systems or electricity grids are trying to make sure that the supply and the demand are close together. And when one switches, this is why we want dispatchable sources of power to try to always follow the demand and meet it. So again, if there's more demand, we want to try to produce more power. If there's less, we want to try to cut back so we're always matching. So one thing to keep in mind is that most intermittent sources are also not dispatchable. And when we look at solar and wind, the reason why is because they're either there or they're not. An electricity operator can't say, well, we don't have enough solar electricity, let's produce more sunlight. If you're using wind turbines, you can't say, the wind needs to blow faster. The wind and the sun are either there or they're not. So basically, you cannot produce more or less depending on demand very easily. The one exception in how we can make these sources of energy dispatchable is if we have some kind of storage. While batteries are still relatively expensive and they're not used very often to help manage the electricity system, in the future there's hopes that they'll get cheaper and cheaper and we'll see more sources of battery power being used. In that case, if we have too much wind or too much solar, but we can store it in some way like in a battery, then the idea is that in the future, maybe when it's cloudy and we don't have enough wind, it's cloudy and we don't have enough sun, or the wind is still and we don't have enough wind energy, we would be able to use the energy stored in the batteries instead. Coal and nuclear power, which are often some of the biggest power plants that we have in our electricity systems, are dispatchable, but they are not dispatchable very easily. So they can go up and down, but it often takes them hours to be able to do so. And part of the reason why this is because these sorts of systems are typically designed to be what's known as baseload power. So generally speaking, in any electricity system, there's always going to be some amount of electricity being used. Even at night, we need power for things like refrigerators and freezers, for example, the businesses that are open overnight, things like hospitals that operate 24 hours a day as well. That means that even when energy use is at its lowest, there's always going to be some. Baseload power is basically what meets the demand of energy that's always being used. So normally when we use coal and nuclear power sources, that's the kind of energy that's basically the kind of energy uses that we're trying to use it for. So we can basically stop and start up coal plants, and we can do the same with nuclear plants, but even in most up-to-date systems, it can often take many hours. So in some cases, this is not fast enough to be able to match the supply and demand. So this is good that it's dispatchable, but it's not particularly fast. Natural gas plants that produce electricity are extremely dispatchable in most cases. And in many electricity systems, as natural gas has become less competitive compared to renewable sources of energy, often the gas plants are used for this primary purpose, and they become what are known as peaker plants. So what that means is that basically at different points in the day, our energy use reaches its highest point, or like the peak of a mountain. In Ontario, that is typically around 5 or 6 in the afternoon on weekdays when everyone has left work and they're starting to come home. And all of a sudden, everyone's turning on their air conditioning or their heaters, their stoves to be able to do cooking, their kettles to make a cup of tea. Energy use tends to go up very quickly around 5 or 6 when everyone is starting to arrive home. Natural gas essentially is able to go from that low point of demand, say at 3 to 4 p.m., and meet the demand as everyone is coming home. It's not only dispatchable, but it's extremely fast, and a peaker plant is designed to be able to meet that kind of demand. So this is really good for ensuring a reliable electricity system, but the key downside, of course, is that natural gas is contributing global warming emissions. Another big problem is that peaker plants are extraordinarily expensive. Because they're not always running, the power that they're producing is relatively more expensive compared to other sources. And this is a graph that's showing the learning curves or the lack of learning curves for different sources of energy, including fossil fuels as well as nuclear. So the concept of a learning curve we discussed previously, and if there's a learning curve, it means that things are becoming cheaper over time. We pointed out previously that natural gas is following a learning curve, and this is also true of natural gas peaker plants. However, they are the most expensive form of energy that systems are currently using nowadays. On average, it costs about $175 to produce 1 megawatt hour of electricity. So this is more expensive than even nuclear, which is becoming more expensive over time. And it's a lot more expensive than combined gas plants, which are the plants that normally are always running. So again, even though natural gas can help us meet our electricity demands or be turned off if we need less, it's also a very expensive way to make sure that the system is running smoothly. Hydroelectricity has a lot of advantages when it comes to dispatchability. So in a typical hydroelectric installation, there are many different turbines where we're pushing water over them in order to turn them to generate electricity. If we need to produce less electricity, generally speaking, we can take those turbines offline so they're no longer being powered that way. And we can do this generally in a matter of seconds or even minutes. That makes hydroelectricity very responsive. If it turns out that we need to have more power later on, we can turn those turbines back on once again in a matter of minutes or even sometimes in seconds. Another big advantage of some hydroelectricity installations is that in some cases, the companies that run those systems have installed what are known as pumped storage reservoirs. This was discussed a little bit previously, and just as a reminder, this is basically where when we have too much electricity, we use that electricity to pump water into some kind of storage area. Later on, when we need more electricity, what we do is we release that water, and we use that water to power a turbine in some way. This is not technically considered a battery, but this is one of the biggest ways that the world currently stores excess energy for later use. So not only is hydroelectricity very dispatchable, but often we can use extra energy to create storage later on when maybe the demand for electricity is going to be higher. That means in places where hydroelectricity is an option, and it's a really big energy producer in Ontario, it means it's one of the best options that we have to meet shifting demand. So whether it goes up or down, hydroelectricity is one of the best options to make sure that we're matching supply and demand. So let's apply these ideas and concepts to an example that is going to become much more common as global warming gets worse, and it's the problem of the weather's too hot and we want to turn on our air conditioning. So what ends up happening when it gets too hot is that a lot of different homes and businesses start turning on their air conditioning, which is obviously going to spike electricity demand. So if you're operating an electricity system, you need to figure out some way to make extra electricity available. And the sources that are going to be available to you are going to depend on the intermittency of the energy sources as well as their dispatchability. So let's look at some ways that this could become a problem depending on the different sources of energy. So let's say that we're trying to meet the problem of air conditioning with non-dispatchable intermittent sources like solar and wind. So this means, once again, that they're not always available and the amount of energy that they're producing can often be variable. If we build a lot of wind turbines in order to power our air conditioning, we're going to potentially run into trouble. As we pointed out previously, wind power tends to be highest in the winter months, not the summer months. So again, at the time when it's most hot, this is also the time where we tend to have the least amount of wind energy. Now you might think because solar is also intermittent and non-dispatchable, it would be a bad idea for air conditioning as well. But the situation here is a little bit more complex. While it is true that we can't simply produce more solar if we want more solar, and we don't have a way to basically turn more on, we also know that when we need air conditioning is also the time that solar panels tend to produce the most energy. So the hottest part of the day tends to also be a very sunny part of the day. The hottest part of the year tends to be in summer when solar power is going to produce more. So one of the things that we have to consider is the things that are going to potentially increase or decrease electricity demand. With something like air conditioning, it's fairly predictable. We know that demand is going to tend to be highest on hot days, on sunny days, and it's going to be highest in the summer. And it just so happens that that coincides usually with when solar power is the most productive. So even though we can't turn solar power on or off, it can still be extremely useful if we're trying to meet the demands for something like increased demand for air conditioning. Now, we also have different challenges depending on the sources of electricity that we're using to dispatch with things besides solar and wind power. Nuclear and coal, as we pointed out, are relatively slow to ramp up. But if we know that there's going to be increased demand for something, we could essentially anticipate and start the process early on in the day. So if the weather forecast suggests that it's going to be extremely hot and there's going to be increased demand for air conditioning, then a nuclear power plant operator or a coal plant operator could essentially start the operation of that plant early in the morning so that once the demand actually starts happening, then we're going to have that matching situation of demand and supply. So even sources that dispatch relatively slowly can be used if we have other information, like in this case, the weather forecast that might tell us how hot the day is expected to be. Hydroelectricity, once again, is really going to be useful here because it can respond to much faster or sudden increases or decreases in demand. So again, remember that it only takes seconds or minutes to make sure that we have either less or more hydroelectricity. So let's imagine that we have a demand spike. And this could happen when everybody comes home and suddenly they realize, the house is too warm, I'm going to turn on the air conditioning. If tens of thousands of homes start doing this all at the same time, we're going to see the demand for electricity go up relatively suddenly. If we have hydroelectricity, however, we can start turning on or ramping up those water turbines to generate more electricity. So basically, it's going to help us respond to that sudden increase in demand. If it goes the other way, hydro can also help by turning off as well. So let's say that all of a sudden in an hour, it gets very, very cloudy, the sky turns very cool, it turns very gray, and we get a sudden storm that starts to cool everything off. All of a sudden, people are going to start turning off their air conditioning and opening up their windows instead. So in that case, what we can start to do is to disengage or ramp down all of those water turbines so that we're not producing any excess amount of electricity. So in this case, hydroelectricity being so responsive really can help us deal with the shorter term shifts or the more sudden shifts. Slower dispatching sources like coal and nuclear, we're going to need a little bit more information and try to be able to anticipate what's going on in advance. But even though they're relatively slow, they can still be useful if we know, for example, if the day is going to be hot or not. And we can also use other information like, is it going to be sunny or windy? So on a day where it's not very windy, for example, Ontario has a lot of wind energy, but if it's not windy, it's not going to generate a lot. So that might be an indicator to the system that they're going to need to find other sources of energy like nuclear, natural gas, and hydroelectricity to try to even things up. So to summarize some of the main ideas presented in this video, intermittency means that power production from a source varies a lot. Solar and wind are highly intermittent because they're highly dependent on what's going on in the environment. Solar produces a lot less power in shady environments, for example, and it doesn't produce any at all at night. Similarly, wind is intermittent because the wind speed varies a lot. And we know that there are patterns such as the summers being less windy than the winters, which also affect the amount of power being produced depending on the time of year. So both of these sources, as a result, are highly intermittent. Dispatchability means that power production can go up and down, and that it can be turned off or on. And that means that we can balance out the system and the supply and demand if something is highly dispatchable. So to summarize some of the key points from this video, intermittency means that the amount of energy that's being produced by a source varies a lot. Solar and wind power are good examples of highly intermittent sources. Solar produces a lot less in the early and late parts of the day and a lot less on cloudy days and doesn't produce any at all overnight. Wind only produces when it's windy, and that depends also on things like the time of year, as it tends to produce more during the colder months. We also know that dispatchability of different sources makes a big difference as well. And if something is dispatchable, it means that it can easily be turned on or off ramped up or down very easily. So we know that solar and wind are not dispatchable at all. Either we have sunlight or wind, or we don't. So we either have the energy source or we don't. And we can't simply say, I need more wind or I need more sun to be able to produce more from these sources. Coal and nuclear are dispatchable, but they are slow and they generally take hours to do so, whereas natural gas and especially hydroelectricity can do so much faster. And the reason why fast matters is because we can sometimes have relatively fast shifts in the amount of energy that's being used. Sometimes it spikes up and we need to turn things on relatively quickly, and sometimes it collapses and we need to be able to turn things off relatively quickly. So again, dispatchable sources basically mean that we can respond to increases or decreases in demand much more easily. Intermittent and non-dispatchable sources like wind and solar do make managing an electricity system a lot more challenging because, again, we can't easily store them, we cannot easily add more or take away less of them. But we want to remember that they are still useful in a lot of situations. As we pointed out, because the times that we need air conditioning also tend to coincide when we have a lot of sunlight, solar panels can be very useful if we think of them as a way to help us power our, maybe not our general electricity system, but to be devoted to something like producing more air conditioning. So again, if we think about the ways that intermittent and non-dispatchable sources like wind and solar can work with certain kinds of other demands, they can still be extremely useful in a modern electricity system.